All right, welcome to your very own deep dive. Today we are going to try to crack the code of supercommunicators, those people who just seem to make conversations flow so easily. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You sent in some really interesting material,
Yeah.
excerpts from a book called Supercommunicators.
Okay.
It's Teacher's Guide,
Mm-hmm.
and a podcast interview with the author, Charles Duhigg.
Oh, cool.
So let's dive in and see what we can learn.
Yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready when you are. I think Duhigg's own story is a really great place to start because it really grabbed my attention.
Yeah.
He's a journalist, so communication is, his bread and butter.
Right.
Yet he opens the book talking about feeling totally lost, trying to talk to his wife
Oh, wow.
and colleagues.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, it's super relatable.
it is.
Like, it's just so human.
It is.
I mean, even the pros, right?
Yeah.
Hit a wall sometimes with communication.
Yeah.
And it's this struggle, that leads him to this idea that we're often having like 3 conversations at once
Cool.
without even realizing it.
Interesting.
He calls these the practical, the emotional, and the social conversations. So practical is all about what's the info here? What are we actually trying to do?
Right.
Emotional is like, what are the feelings underneath?
Right.
Are we seeking like validation, support, things like that?
Hmm.
And then social is about, I guess, how our rules and identities like are kind of playing into the whole interaction.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense because I feel like a lot of times if people are having communication issues, the problem is they're just not on the same page,
Yeah. Yeah. So how do we actually, how do we spot these different conversations happening?
That's the key, isn't it? It's tricky. But I think if you just think about it this way, it gets a little bit easier. Like if someone says, I just feel so unheard.
Okay.
That's a pretty clear signal they're in an emotional conversation.
Right. Yeah.
But if it's like, okay, but what's the plan now?
Right.
That's practical.
That's action oriented.
Yeah. The words that people choose, the tone,
Yeah.
even their body language can give you clues.
Okay. So once we learn to recognize these different levels, what do we do with that information?
Right. I mean, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's where Duhigg's idea of mismatches comes in, right?
Okay.
He uses this example of complaining to his wife about a vacation that had gone wrong.
Okay.
And he wanted her to commiserate with him, to have an emotional conversation.
Yeah.
But she was already in practical mode thinking about solutions,
Oh, no.
which led to a clash.
So it's like almost like I'm speaking Spanish and you're speaking French.
Exactly.
And we're both just kind of like, what?
And it happens all the time, doesn't it?
Right.
Recognizing the mismatch, though, that's the first step
Okay.
to bridging the gap, right?
Right.
It's about adjusting your approach to meet the other person where they are.
It makes you wonder how many arguments could be avoided if we all just had this lens,
Yeah,
the 3 conversations lens.
totally.
But even if we are on the same page, on the same conversational level, right?
Yeah.
There's still this mystery of how some people just make you feel instantly connected. You know what I mean?
It's true. And that's where I think this idea of neural entrainment comes in, which is fascinating.
Okay.
So essentially, when we connect deeply with someone, our brains and bodies kind of sync up.
Oh, wow.
We start breathing at a similar rate. Our heartbeats align.
Really?
Even our brainwaves fall into a similar pattern.
Isn't that wild?
That is wild. So it's not just a feeling.
No.
Like there's actual science
There is.
behind this clicking with someone.
Yeah. Think about it this way. You know how there are specific brainwave patterns?
Yeah.
Like alpha waves?
Right.
And they're associated with relaxation and focus.
When 2 people are truly engaged in a conversation, really connecting, their brains show very similar activity in those areas. It's like their neural activity is dancing in sync.
That's really cool. You know what? Duhigg's example on the podcast, actually, I think brings this to life a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
He asks the host who they would call on a bad day, and they immediately think about their grandmother. Right. And I bet we all have someone like that.
We do.
Someone who just kind of makes us feel better just by being present,
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like these natural entrainers,
Right.
people who just effortlessly create this sense of connection, and synchrony. Now, imagine if we could learn to consciously cultivate this ability.
Right. Like, how cool would that be? And I think that's where his research gets so interesting. He just kind of dives into the techniques that supercommunicators actually use
Yeah.
to create that kind of instant rapport. And he talks about this guy, Felix, who's a former CIA officer, who was basically like a communication ninja. Even experts couldn't figure out how he was doing it at first.
That's intriguing.
Right.
Yeah.
They studied him intensely.
Oh.
Like, they analyzed his conversations, his body language, everything.
So interesting.
To figure out, like, what was his secret sauce.
Yeah.
And what they discovered is that, like, he wasn't relying on tricks or anything.
Oh.
His power came from a genuine desire to connect.
Interesting.
So what were his actual strategies? I mean, I'm, like, dying to know, like, how to channel my inner communication ninja.
I know, me too. Well, for starters, he was a master at asking deep personal questions. Not just like, what do you do?
Right.
But questions that really tapped into people's values and motivations.
Give me an example. Like, what kind of question?
So imagine you're talking to a doctor.
Okay.
Instead of asking them, like, where's your office?
Yeah.
You could ask, what inspired you to pursue medicine in the first place?
Oh.
You see the difference. It shifts the focus from the factual to the personal, which invites a more meaningful response.
Oh, I like that. It's about sparking a real conversation.
Yeah.
Not just exchanging information.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he didn't stop there.
Okay.
He was also incredibly skilled at revealing vulnerabilities about himself.
Okay.
Creating an atmosphere of trust and reciprocity.
Oh, okay.
It's like he was saying, hey, I'm willing to open up to you, so maybe you'll feel comfortable opening up to me.
That makes sense. Like, vulnerability breeds connection.
Yeah.
But doesn't that get tricky? Like, where's the line between being authentic and oversharing? And what about those times when you need to build rapport quickly,
Right.
Like, I don't know, like a negotiation or like a first date?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Are there any shortcuts?
Right.
I don't know. Well, that's where Duhigg's distinction between matching and mimicry becomes so crucial,
Oh.
and where I think things get really interesting.
Okay. Matching versus mimicry. I have a feeling this is going to be one of those, like, big aha moments for our listeners.
Yeah, I think so. For sure.
Okay, matching versus mimicry. I have a feeling this is going to be one of those, like, big aha moments for our listeners.
It really is, yeah. Like a game changer, really. Think of it this way, like mimicry is like trying to copy someone's outfit.
Okay.
It might look similar on the surface, but it doesn't feel authentic
Right.
because it's not really you.
Right.
Matching, on the other hand, is about understanding the essence of someone's style
Okay.
and finding ways to, like, resonate with it on your own terms.
So it's less about, like, mirroring their exact words or gestures.
Yeah.
And more about tuning into, like, their energy, I guess.
Exactly.
And responding in a way that, like, feels genuine to you.
It's about creating a sense of harmony and understanding without losing your own voice in the process.
Duhigg gives this hilarious example of bad matching. Okay, so imagine someone is telling you about a deeply personal loss, right?
Okay.
And you respond by saying, oh, that's awful. My dog died last year and it was so hard.
Ouch. Yeah. That's a classic case of missing the mark. Like, it completely shifts the focus away from the other person's experience and back onto yourself.
Yeah. And it's not that you don't care,
Right.
about their loss.
Oh, of course not.
It's just, in that moment, what they need is empathy, right?
Right.
And validation,
Yeah,
not a
yeah.
competing story.
Exactly. True matching is about recognizing the other person's emotional state and meeting them there. It might be reflecting their feelings back to them, asking clarifying questions, or just offering a listening ear. It's about being present and attuned to their needs.
Okay, so how do we get better at this matching thing
Right.
without, like, accidentally veering into mimicry territory? Are there any practical tips?
Oh, yeah, for sure there are. Duhigg offers some really actionable techniques that anyone can use, like, right away. One of my favorites is this looping for understanding technique.
Oh, looping for understanding. Okay, tell me more about this.
Yeah, it's so simple, but it's so powerful.
Okay.
It's all about active listening. Basically, you ask a question to clarify something the other person said, then you summarize what you heard in your own words, and then you confirm with them that you understood correctly.
So it's like creating this feedback loop where you're like constantly checking in to make sure you're not making assumptions or like misinterpreting what they're saying.
Exactly, exactly. And it's especially helpful in like conflict situations or when you're discussing like really complex topics.
Okay.
It helps prevent misunderstandings and ensures that, everyone feels heard and understood.
I've actually been experimenting with this technique in my own conversations lately, and it's kind of amazing how much it like diffuses tension.
Really?
Yeah, and builds rapport.
That's awesome.
Yeah, sometimes like the act of summarizing someone's point of view, it helps them feel validated and understood,
Yeah, I think so too. It's a real game changer. And the best part is like it works in all sorts of situations.
Okay.
From, casual chats with friends to like, high stakes negotiations.
Okay, so we've talked about the 3 conversations and the art of matching, but there's another layer to all of this, right?
Yeah.
The whole idea of social identities and how they like shape our interactions.
Totally.
This feels like a really, really important piece of the puzzle, especially when we're talking about like those really tough conversations that can be so emotionally charged,
Absolutely, yeah. And Duhigg actually dives into this concept in a really insightful way. He reminds us that we all carry these like multiple social identities based on, our race, our gender, our religion, our profession, so on and so forth.
Right.
And these identities can have a profound impact on, how we communicate and how we perceive others.
It's like we're all wearing these invisible badges,
Yeah.
That kind of signal to others who we are and where we fit in.
Exactly. Exactly. And sometimes like those badges can lead to misunderstandings or biases or even conflict, especially when we're talking about, sensitive topics.
Right.
Like race or politics or religion.
It makes me think of that concept of stereotype threat. You ever heard of this?
Yeah.
Where even positive stereotypes can create anxiety and pressure for people who belong to certain groups.
For sure.
Like the idea that Asian Americans are good at math.
Right.
On the surface, it seems like a compliment, right?
Yeah.
But it can actually make people feel like they have to constantly live up to that expectation, which can be incredibly stressful.
For sure. It's a powerful reminder that even like seemingly harmless stereotypes can have like a real impact on how we interact with each other. And it highlights the importance of being, mindful of our own biases and assumptions.
So how do we navigate these like tricky waters? How do we have conversations about these important but like potentially divisive topics in a way that feels, I don't know, constructive and respectful even when we disagree?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, Duhigg points to a fascinating example that I think really sheds light on this challenge. He tells this story of Dr. Rosenblum, who's a pediatrician.
Okay.
And he was struggling to convince parents to vaccinate their children.
Right.
And he was presenting all the scientific evidence, like explaining the benefits of vaccines, but he was still encountering a lot of resistance.
It's like that saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Sometimes, like, logic and facts just aren't enough.
Totally, yeah.
To change someone's mind, especially when it comes to, like, deeply held beliefs.
It's so true. And what Dr. Rosenblum realized is that he needed to change his approach.
Okay.
He started using a technique called motivational interviewing.
Motivational interview.
Which focuses on understanding the other person's values and motivation.
Okay.
Building rapport and finding common ground.
So instead of, like, lecturing parents about the importance of vaccines, he was trying to, like, meet them where they were.
Yes.
And, like, understand their concerns.
He would ask open-ended questions like, what are your biggest concerns about vaccines? Or like, what information would help you feel more comfortable making a decision?
Okay.
It was about inviting a dialogue rather than dictating information.
And did this new approach actually work?
Remarkably, yes.
Yeah.
By shifting his focus from persuading to understanding, Dr. Rosenblum was able to connect with parents on a deeper level and help them make, informed decisions that aligned with their values.
That's such a powerful example of how even in those really, really challenging conversations, there's always room for empathy and connection. And it kind of brings us back to that idea of matching, doesn't it?
It really does, yeah.
It's about meeting the other person where they are emotionally and intellectually, even if you don't see eye to eye on everything.
Absolutely, yeah. And this principle applies not just to conversations about vaccines, but to any topic that might be sensitive or potentially divisive.
So what are some practical ways we can apply this like motivational interviewing approach in our own lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, think about a time when you were trying to convince someone of something and it just wasn't working.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe you were trying to, like, persuade a friend to see your point of view on, like, a political issue. Or maybe you were trying to get a family member to, adopt a healthier lifestyle.
I think we've all been there.
Yeah.
It can be so frustrating
It is.
when you feel like you're talking to a brick wall.
Exactly. In those moments, I think it can be really helpful to take a step back and ask yourself, like, what are this person's underlying motivations? What are their fears and concerns? What's important to them?
So it's about trying to understand the why behind their resistance
Yeah,
rather than just focusing on the, like, what of their disagreement.
precisely, yeah. And once you start to understand their perspective, you can start to, like, tailor your communication in a way that resonates with their values.
Okay.
It's about finding common ground and building a bridge of understanding.
It sounds like a much more, like, compassionate and effective approach than just, like, trying to win an argument or force someone to see things your way.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And it's a skill that takes practice, but it's so worth the effort.
Okay.
It can transform the way you communicate and help you build, stronger, more meaningful relationships.
Now, Duhigg doesn't just leave us with these, like, theoretical concepts, right?
No.
He also dives into the nitty-gritty of, like, how to handle those really, really tough conversations, the ones that most of us tend to avoid like the plague.
Right.
He even talks about this program that brought together like gun rights activists and gun control advocates for a weekend retreat.
Oh my gosh, talk about a recipe for fireworks.
Oh,
I can't even imagine the tension in that room.
right. But the organizers had this like brilliant strategy. Instead of trying to get everyone to agree on gun control,
Yeah.
they focused on teaching people how to have difficult conversations without resorting to anger and hostility.
Oh,
They
interesting.
wanted people to like understand the root of the conflict.
Okay.
The emotions, the values, the experiences that were driving their perspectives.
Yeah, it sounds like they were trying to create a space
Mhm.
where people could, like, disagree respectfully
Yeah.
and maybe even find some common ground.
Exactly. Exactly. And one of the participants, this guy named John Godfrey, who described himself as a gun-loving fanatic, had this like totally transformative experience. He went into the retreat expecting to argue with everyone, but he ended up realizing that effective communication isn't about winning or proving the other person wrong. It's about understanding why the conflict exists, acknowledging the emotions involved, and finding ways to connect on a human level.
That's so powerful, really. It reminds me of that saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
I love that. And it ties back to everything we've been talking about, doesn't it? The importance of listening, empathizing, and finding common ground, even in the most challenging conversations.
It really does, yeah. And, in these highly charged discussions, it's even more critical to ensure that you're not just, waiting for your turn to speak,
Right.
but actively listening and seeking to understand.
Duhigg also emphasizes the importance of avoiding generalizations and like speaking from personal experience.
Okay.
So instead of saying all gun owners are irresponsible,
Right.
you might share a personal anecdote about a time when you felt unsafe around firearms.
Okay.
It's a way to make the conversation more relatable and less accusatory.
Yeah, yeah. It shifts the focus from, like, attacking the other person's beliefs to sharing your own experiences and vulnerability.
Yeah.
Which can create a more conducive environment for dialogue.
And this is so relevant, right?
It is.
That current climate
Absolutely.
where it feels like everyone is just shouting their opinions from like their respective corners of the internet.
Yeah, yeah. It's more important than ever to remember that, like, behind those differing opinions are real people with lived experiences that shape their perspectives.
Now, we've talked a lot about matching,
Yeah.
as a key to effective communication. But how does this concept translate to those really tough conversations where like emotions run high
Right.
and the stakes feel incredibly personal?
That's a great question. Duhigg explores this through the example of Netflix, actually.
Oh, yeah. I remember this. Netflix faced some like pretty serious internal conflicts related to diversity and inclusion,
They did, yeah.
especially like in their content.
Right. And they actually brought in an expert, Verna Myers,
Okay.
to help them navigate these challenging discussions.
Okay.
And her approach was revolutionary, really.
So instead of focusing on like avoiding conflict or trying to be colorblind, she actually encouraged employees to like lean into the discomfort,
Oh, wow.
acknowledge their own biases,
Yeah.
and engage in like open and honest dialogue about race and identity.
It was about creating a space where people felt safe to share their experiences, even if those experiences were, uncomfortable or challenging for others to hear.
And this approach was a game changer for Netflix. Like, it wasn't about achieving some, like, utopian ideal of perfect harmony, right?
No, not at all.
It was about fostering this culture of, like, open communication and mutual respect.
It was about recognizing that discomfort is an inevitable part of growth and progress, particularly when we're addressing deeply rooted societal issues.
Now, here's something I found particularly insightful. Duhigg highlights the importance of, like, drawing out multiple identities in these conversations.
Oh, that's so interesting, yeah. It's about recognizing that, we're not just one-dimensional beings defined by a single identity. We're, complex individuals with multifaceted experiences and perspectives.
Right. So, for example, instead of seeing someone solely as a Black woman,
Right.
we might acknowledge her other identities. Her role as a mother, her profession, her passions, her struggles.
Totally. Yeah, it helps to break down stereotypes.
Right.
And create a more nuanced and empathetic understanding of the other person.
And this ties back to the idea of, like, finding common ground.
It does, yeah.
Even when discussing, like, really divisive issues, like, we might discover shared values, experiences, or aspirations that, like, transcend our differences.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even in the midst of conflict, there's always the potential for, connection and understanding.
Wow. This has been, like, quite a journey. I feel like we've uncovered so many valuable insights about communication.
Me too.
And I'm sure listeners feeling the same way. But before we wrap up, I think it's important to take a moment to, like, summarize some of the key takeaways.
Yeah, I agree. Let's distill this down to the essentials.
All right, so let's see if we can kind of, like, boil all this down,
Yeah.
into some, I don't know, key takeaways.
Right.
First off, like, remembering those three conversations: practical, emotional, and social.
Right.
That can really help us decode what's really going on
Better.
in like any interaction,
Yeah.
It's almost like having X-ray vision
Yeah, it's true.
for communication.
It's like a superpower.
Right. And once you see those different levels at play,
Yeah.
the next step is kind of mastering the art of matching, which, like we said,
Right.
goes way beyond just mimicking.
It does.
It's about understanding their energy and responding in a way that builds, like, real connection. We talked about techniques like looping,
Yeah.
for understanding, which can help with that.
Totally.
And it's crucial to remember, right,
Yeah.
that we're not just communicating with, like, a disembodied voice, right?
Boom.
We're interacting with, like, a whole person,
Exactly.
complete with their own unique set of social identities, experiences, and all that.
All of it. All of it.
And that's where empathy becomes, like, so essential.
It really does.
Right. We have to be mindful of how those identities might be shaping the conversation, especially when we're tackling, tougher topics.
Right.
I mean, Dr. Rosenblum's story about using motivational interviewing
Yes.
to connect with those vaccine-hesitant parents
Okay.
was just a great example of that.
It was a powerful example.
Yeah, and it really shows how powerful it can be to shift from that convince them mindset
Totally.
to more of an understand them mindset.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about something Duhigg mentioned towards the end of the book.
Oh, yeah.
This study from Harvard that followed, like, a group of men
Okay.
for decades.
Wow, decades.
Yeah, it's called the Harvard Study of Adult Development.
Oh, right. Yeah, I've heard of this, yeah.
Super fascinating. It's yielded all these insights into what makes for a happy and fulfilling life,
Yeah.
And what just, like, blew me away was that, like, the single biggest predictor of happiness and longevity wasn't wealth.
Okay.
It wasn't fame, success.
Wow.
It was the quality of their relationships.
That's amazing. I mean, it really just underscores the profound impact that connection has on our well-being.
Doesn't it?
And communication is the heart of, strong relationships.
Absolutely. And it makes you realize that all those, like, everyday conversations we have,
Yeah.
all those little interactions, they're actually, like, the building blocks
Yeah.
for a more meaningful life.
It's like that saying, the little things are the big things.
Right.
And when you view communication through that lens, I think it just takes on a whole new significance.
It really does. It really does. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I have one final question for you, our listener.
Oh, I like this, yeah.
Think about someone you consider a super communicator. What is it about the way they communicate that makes you feel seen, heard, and understood? That's a great question for reflection, for our listeners. Just pay attention to those little things they do, the questions they ask, the way they listen, the words they choose, even their body language. There's just so much we can learn from observing those natural masters of connection.
I love that. And remember, we all have that potential within us, right?
Yeah.
It's about honing those skills, embracing the, messy but beautiful dance of human interaction, and recognizing the power we have to create meaningful connections through the way we communicate.
Beautifully said. So keep exploring, keep practicing, and keep those conversations flowing.
Until next time, happy communication.